traditionally, we've always classified mergers into roughly three categories: horizontal, which is relatively clear; vertical, which is relatively clear; and this third classification of potential competition, or sometimes called conglomerate mergers. Just a couple of observations first. Most nominally horizontal mergers are only partially horizontal. Many of them include a great deal of product complementarity, about which we've heard a fair amount this morning. And I want to spend a little bit of time on that. But one important thing is that the greater the amount of complementarity between the merger parties, the greater the opportunity for cost savings, product improvements, or other efficiency gains, and also the less reliable our standard measures of market concentration or concentration increases are, such as the HHI. Vertical mergers are strictly mergers of complements, and I believe should be addressed in that way. Most potential competition mergers are really a form of horizontal merger. And indeed, at least in the US, I think the one hurdle we need to clear fairly soon, and the 2023 guidelines ignore it, is how do modern methodologies for market definition affect potential competition merger analysis? That is to say, the 2023 guidelines are basically a snapshot of potential competition merger doctrine where it was left in 1974, when the Supreme Court basically got out of the business of evaluating mergers substantively. At the time, market definition largely focused on pure incumbents. Today, we include in the market, under the hypothetical monopolist test, all firms that would be in the market in response to a small but significant increase in price, which means basically those who would be in the market without commitment of significant sunk cost. The result is that a great deal of the territory that was occupied by potential competition back in the 1960s and 70s would now be included within market definition. I'm not saying everything, but there's a much narrower range for potential competition merger analysis, as long as we use the hypothetical monopolist test to define markets. Now, my proposal is that we ditch this entire classification system, and that we move to a two classification regime in which mergers are classified either as those that facilitate collusion harm, that is, that limit competition among either the parties themselves or the market as a whole, that is traditionally horizontal mergers. That would include potential competition mergers. And then secondly, we have a classification of mergers that facilitate anti-competitive foreclosure. That would include all mergers whose principal effect is union of complements by the merging firms, and that would automatically include all vertical mergers as well. Under this proposal, a merger could be challenged under both theories. Like even today, a merger can be challenged as both horizontal and as vertical. However, the two theories may push in very different directions. That is, the horizontal theory may favor condemning a merger, while the complementary theory might conclude that a merger is not merely harmless, but actually welfare improving. The first acknowledged merger, I'm a lawyer, by the way, and I sometimes get caught up in the history a little bit. So there will be a burdensome amount of history in this talk. But the first acknowledged merger of complements was the Sidney Winslow case in 1913. Winslow was one of the less notorious of the robber barons. he doesn't always rank up there with Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. He was the founder of United Shoe Machinery Company. And basically, the way he formed United Shoe Machinery was by identifying the 5 largest manufacturers of the 5 types of machines that were used at that time to make leather shoes: lasting machines, sewing machines, outsole stitching machines, healing machines, and metallic button fastening machines. A lot of shoes at this point had buttons rather than ties. He acquired all of these firms, moved their technology to a single plant in Beverly, Massachusetts, and began leasing out a full array of shoemaking equipment from that firm, from that location. And USM went on to become one of the more storied monopolists of the 20th century in the United States, yielding a very important decision by Judge Wazanski in the 1950s, and then finally a decision breaking up the monopoly into its constituent parts, into its original constituent parts in 1968. Justice Holmes, who wrote the opinion in Sidney Winslow, made very short work of this merger of complements. He said, well, these people don't compete with each other. They're each making a different type of machine used in the making of shoes. So on its face, he said this was really an effort at nothing more than greater efficiency and so on. So that was the first acknowledged merger of complements. Now, the fact is that complementary relationships and mergers have dominated over their long history. I'm going to talk about a couple of these cases. I'll talk about Northern Securities and Columbia Steel. Brown and Kenny was treated as a horizontal merger. And in fact, both Brown and Kenny made shoes. Brown made higher quality, higher priced shoes that were all leather and stitched. Kenny made cheaper shoes that used a certain number of synthetic components, and they were partly glued. And so one of the things that Brown was hoping to acquire through the merger was a wider variety of products that would appeal to people at a lower price point. So that would bring more lower income shoe buyers into its stores, because it was also vertically integrated into retailing. Vaughn's Grocery, about 7 years later, was treated as a horizontal merger of 2 grocery chains in Los Angeles, Vaughn's and Shopping Bag. In fact, as Justice Potter Stewart pointed out in his dissent, if you mapped the 2 chains out in Los Angeles was found to be the relevant market. If you mapped them out in Los Angeles, you found that all of the Vaughn's grocery stores were in the northwestern part of the city. Shopping bag stores were in the southeastern, and there was just a tiny area right in the middle, which, according to Potter Stewart, accounted for about 1% of its sales, where the two chains actually overlapped. General Dynamics, another famous case, involved a merger between a company that deep mined coal and another company that strip mined coal. And although the final products were competitive for most purposes, the technology used to produce the coal was entirely different, and the reserves that supplied the coal were very different from one another. So anyway, complementarity comes in a lot of varieties. The Supreme Court the courts have ignored it more often than not. And as a result, its nature needs to be analyzed much more individually. It's also subject to the limitation that there may be non-merger alternatives to dealing with the problem of complementarity. The first big Supreme Court case that involved complements did not recognize it. That was actually the first Supreme Court case on the merits, and the United States, U.S. versus Trans-Missouri Freight Association in 1897, which treated as price fixing a joint running arrangement among numerous railroads. It is today described typically in a single sentence as the first case that applied something like the per se rule to naked price fixing. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. It was a joint venture that fused together numerous small railroads. Railroads are mainly chartered by the states. Most of them operated within a single state. The Eighth Circuit upheld the venture, relying on a report from the newly created Interstate Commerce Commission. That's the most vital quotation, that one of the things the venture was designed to do was to facilitate the interchange of traffic and cars. Fares at the time had to be computed with a pencil and paper and charged either by the shipping agent or by the receiving agent. And that was the justification offered for the rate fixing. We have to have a common set of rate standards so that the agent can compute, because as the Eighth Circuit noted, often when you shipped a parcel from one point to another point, it passed through the hands of several different carriers. The one thing that that paragraph does not mention is that the joint running arrangements also included track gauge agreements. Track gauge refers to how far apart the rails are. They were non-standardized historically. There was a sort of semi-successful effort to standardize them at the time of the U.S. Civil War, the 1860s, when the Union Pacific Railroad was developed. But one of the things that the joint running arrangements did is they supplied for uniform track gauges, because when freight was transferred, the easiest way to transfer it in large lots was to transfer the cars, not to unload the car at the end of the line and reload it at the end of the next one. Anyway, Justice Peckham blew all of that aside, noted that the agreement set common freight rates, and held that it was not a defense that the rates were alleged to be reasonable. And of course, that set us on the road to the per se rule against price fixing, which I, by the way, wholeheartedly defend, just not its application in the Trans-Missouri case. Poorly behaved kicker. One result of Trans-Missouri and aggressive use of the per se rule against joint ventures was a large number of mergers, and particularly mergers in the railroad industry. So we experienced a great merger wave. Nomi Lamoureux, one of Fiona Scott Morton's colleagues, has written extremely well about the big American merger wave. And one common theory about the wave is that was in fact caused by, or at least contributed to by, aggressive enforcement against cartels and joint ventures. And so the firms tried to create by merger what they had been unable to create by joint venture. And so that then takes us to the first real merger case that the US Supreme Court decided in 1904, Northern Securities case, which involved the merger of two east-west continental railroads. The Great Northern Railroad is this. I could not get a map that had both railroads on it, so you have to look at two different maps. But this is the Great Northern Railroad. It ran from the Great Lakes area all the way to the West Coast, and ran just a little bit south of the Canadian border for most of its distance. And then it also had several branch lines that went off in various directions. Those are the red branches. And then in addition to that, there were literally hundreds of branch lines that were owned by different railroads, but that were subject to interconnection agreements. Don't think for 1 minute that interconnection, joint self-preferencing and so on is a unique feature of the digital economy, because it isn't. Many of these debates were played out in the railroad industry already in the very early 20th century. Okay, so that's the Great Northern. Get a little picture of that in your head. This is the Northern Pacific, which also ran east to west, but quite a bit south of the Great Northern, a couple hundred to as much as 1,000 miles to the south. It also had wholly owned branch lines that went off in different directions, and then once again, there were hundreds of small railroads that interconnected with it along the way. And so that then raises the question, was this really a merger of competitors, or was it a merger of complements that were trying to facilitate freight movements to the numerous municipalities located along the way, but not directly on the main trunk line? And the answer is, got a fair amount of literature about this, that for long haul shipments, the two railroads competed quite a bit. If you were going to ship a package from, say, Chicago to San Francisco, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific would compete with each other. On the other hand, if it was a relatively short shipment, a couple hundred miles, then chances were good that the two railroads did not compete with each other at all. But what the merger did do was enable more readily able transfers of freight from one line to another line. Sort of apropos of that is the JetBlue Spirit merger. Now that top picture is probably too confusing to be meaningful, but anyway, that is the route map of JetBlue and Spirit independently. The blue lines are JetBlue, the yellow lines are Spirit. There's quite a few of them, even though these are not the biggest carriers in the US by any means. They do fly a lot of routes. 10% of their routes were overlaps, and those are designated in the second picture at the bottom. There was no really serious dispute that at least on those overlap routes where there was not a lot of third-party competition, the merger would increase fares. At the same time, however, the judge found, I quoted the principal conclusion there, strong evidence that the combined post-merger airlines would be pro-competitive and result in substantial benefits for consumers. And so what do you do when you've got a merger that is found because of interconnection, transfer, possibilities and so on, that overall the merger produces significant benefits, but it does have this problem of the relatively small number of lines where competition was eliminated, and the court applied a fairly orthodox version of what we call the single market rule. It came up yesterday in the context of benefits in secondary markets, but it was developed in Philadelphia Bank, where basically the Supreme Court said you could not balance competitive gains in one market against losses in another market. The argument Philadelphia Bank was that while the merger may have reduced competition in the local market, Carl talked about this a bit yesterday, it would actually serve to increase competition in a more nationwide market where P&B was trying to compete more effectively with New York bankers. And the court said, no, you can't trade them off. Merger law says any line of commerce and, quote, any section of the country. And so all you have to be able to do is identify one product market or one geographic market where competition might be injured. I see some people taking pictures of these. I will send a copy of these slides to anybody who wants them. Just write me an email and you can have them. Okay, so anyway, in my mind, it raises some doubts about the usefulness, the continued usefulness of the single market rule. Now, I have traditionally defended it because of the administrative costs of doing anything else. The one nice thing about the single market rule is that it permits ordinal estimations of harm So, you don't have to quantify the harm. You simply have to say something about its direction. On the other hand, as soon as you get into the business of balancing harms in one market against benefits in another market, now you have to turn those into some kind of cardinal numbers and figure out which one is bigger. I don't think you can do that very often in close cases, although you start looking at a case like JetBlue, where it seems pretty clear, although the judge did not do any balancing himself in the opinion. It seems pretty clear, however, that at least in the judge's mind, the benefits of the merger outweighed the amount of harm on those routes, but that the single market rule forbade him from comparing them. Albertsons, which is currently being litigated, raises some of the same issues. I hope that's not too dark to see. This is a map of the standard metropolitan statistical areas in which Albertsons and Kroger compete. This is a very big grocery store merger currently being litigated. Together, I think they make up the second big, they would, if the merger goes through, they make up the second biggest merger company in the US. Walmart is still bigger than Kroger, Albertsons. If you look at the map, you get a little bit different story. The merger was originally challenged in Washington State, way up there in the northwest corner where there's an overlap area. It was also challenged in Colorado, which is kind of left of center, which is another overlap area. But looking at the country overall, number one, there's a lot of areas where neither one of them has stores. There's a lot of other areas in which one of them, but not the other one, has stores. For example, Kroger's prominent in the Great Lakes kind of central United States. Albertsons is more prominent on the coasts and further west. There are also product market differences. Albertsons is a little bit higher end than Kroger and appeals to a little higher income customer. The general literature on grocery chain mergers is that grocery chain expansion in markets where there is no competition tends towards higher output and lower prices. That is, if the only thing you're doing is adding stores, but you're not eliminating any competition, prices go down and output goes up. On the other hand, if you merge in an area where you've got competing stores in close proximity and they tend to have a fairly substantial share of the market, then you can get higher prices and lower output. So, once again, the single market rule is going to divide all of this up. It's going to require divestiture of many stores. Kroger has volunteered roughly 10% of the stores, but that case is being litigated to this day. And then finally, as another example, I give Columbia Steel. This is a very famous merger chestnut. I think it appears in every single law school case book in the US. It involves US Steel, which was basically the child of Carnegie Steel, big steel company that made mainly heavy steel products, building girders, bridge materials, and so on. And then Consolidated Steel has a bigger circle here because of the more bids, but it's actually a smaller company. Consolidated made mostly small steel products. And furthermore, it was located mainly on the West Coast. And so the government wanted there to be a relevant market. In fact, this is the first case in which the Supreme Court used the term relevant market. The government wanted a relevant market of all steel products, and the court was suspicious of that. I think one pretty important piece of information is looking at bidding behavior. Consolidated during the litigation time period, so roughly 4 years prior to the bringing of the case, had made 6,307 bids. US Steel had made 2,409 bids, although they were bigger projects calling for heavier amounts of steel. However, the two parties bid on the same projects only 166 times. So without waiting, roughly 2%, a little bit less than 2% of the bids were common. Now today, I would guess that that bidding behavior is probably the most accurate signal of what the boundaries of the market are. If the market is what you can get into without significant sunk costs, that would probably a likely determination of that would be where the parties bid. But if that's the case, then these two parties competed with each other for only 2% of their job. And what U.S. Steel was really trying to get out of this was more differentiation in product offerings and geographical diversity. So it was more a merger of production complements than it was of competitors. Okay, so just to summarize very quickly, complementarity shows up in a lot of different ways, a lot of different places. It's ubiquitous among merger firms. It comes up all the time in hospital mergers, for example, where typically it comes up in the guise of factual support for the efficiency defense. Hospital A has a better oncology department. And so the merger will enable the two hospitals to share those resources, or they'll have some heavy investment in hardware or something like that. Many purported efficiency defenses, most of which incidentally fail, are offers to show some element of product complementarity. Merger, well, first of all mergers characterized as vertical or complements. In the innovation case, I'll get to a little bit later on, but the trend has been to look at innovation effects in terms of complementarity rather than simply elimination of competition. By the way, Rich Gilbert at Berkeley has an extremely good book that I recommend. It has a large chapter on innovation and mergers. I'm not going to go through these, but those are some of the efficiency defenses that have been offered. Pretty much all of them relate to some element of product complementarity. By the way, the paper I circulated is a draft, and so I would appreciate any comments you have. It's still kind of a work in progress. The brown shoe era is notable because looking at the vertical aspect of the merger, this is in the 1962 brown shoe case, the Supreme Court relied on the district court's opinion. This was during an era in which most antitrust cases went straight from the district court to the Supreme Court because under the then existing Expediting Act, that's the way antitrust mergers were usually carried upstream. So the district court held that the merger was bad, looking at the vertical aspect of the merger. Brown-Kenny were both competing shoe makers, but they both owned a chain of retail stores. And so it was simultaneously a horizontal merger and a vertical merger. And looking at the vertical merger, the district court condemned it on the theory that it gave post-merger Brown-Kenny a competitive advantage because it reduced the costs of distribution. And as a result, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close to a quote, Brown was able to offer either lower prices or better shoes for the same price. That's the part I always tell my antitrust student. The purpose of merger law is to prevent people from making better shoes. It's not quite that brazen, but that's how it kind of comes out. Under it, there were a number of cases. There were 30 or so cases. This is just a few of the highlights. Foremost Dairies, coming out just after Brown Shoe, was a merger of a traditional dairy firm that made milk and butter and other dairy products and a company that made ice cream. And under the distribution arrangements of the day, they delivered their products by truck to single store grocers, small grocers. And it was condemned under the theory that a firm that made both milk and ice cream would be able to put them into the same truck and deliver them together. And that gave the post-merger firm a competitive advantage over firms that were locked into either ice cream or to milk. Ellis-Chalmers did the same thing for product design. Ellis-Chalmers was a case in which the Ellis-Chalmers basically built rolling mills, which are smallish steel mills. No steel mill is really small, but these were relatively small. And White made the electrical harnesses or hookups that you needed to get one of these mills working. And under the existing arrangements, you would buy your steel mill from one firm, and you'd get your rolling mill from you'd get your electrical hookups from a different firm, and the two together would create a complete mill. And it was condemned under the theory that it created the only firm that was capable of delivering both a fully functioning rolling mill with its electrical hookup in place. That case was cited twice in the draft version of the 2023 merger guidelines. And I wrote a bunch of comments on the draft along with the facetious one. Do you really want to use merger policy to force firms to stick with inferior products? I have no idea whether they paid any attention to what I wrote. However, the two references to the Ellis-Chalmers case came out of the final version of the merger. They kept in a lot of other 1960s vintage cases, but Ellis-Chalmers came out. Same thing with Wilson, which condemned a merger between a firm that made sporting equipment and another one that made gymnastics equipment, because it enabled schools that purchased both types of equipment to engage in one-stop shopping. So in other words, one relic of the brown shoe era was the use of merger law to prevent merging firms from either building better products that consumers wanted more, or distribution arrangements that were more appealing to consumers, all in the name of anti-competitive foreclosure. How much time do I have left?
15 minutes.
15? Okay, thanks. Okay, so the 2023 merger guidelines address complementarity. I applaud them for doing that. They do it in guideline 6, which also addresses vertical mergers, under the rubric of mergers that entrench or extend a dominant position, and that includes things like increased entry barriers, depriving rivals of scale economies, and so on. The one problem I have with this particular guideline is that it makes no attempt to meter or identify anti-competitive from beneficial arrangements that do this. And that's a serious problem. I mean, my test would be, does this merger facilitate a market-wide output reduction or price increase? But that's not articulated in the guidelines. It's really rather, does the merger create a competitive advantage? And the Foremost Dairy case and the Ellis-Chalmers case both did that, to the extent those merging firms were able to deliver a more attractive package of products or produce a better product than had occurred prior to the merger. They did give themselves a competitive advantage over other firms that were not able to do that. Same issue with dominant platform acquisitions of rivals, of startups. Okay, this is a big issue today, gets a lot of attention in this secondary literature. And there are a bunch of them. Wikipedia, by the way, maintains updated sortable lists of all of the small firms that the big tech platforms have acquired. Yeah, so you can look up firms acquired by Amazon, and then you can click on size, industry, date, size of the purchase, and so on. And the number of these acquisitions is in the hundreds. But the one question I think you always have to answer is, are these acquisitions of complements, or are they acquisitions of seriously potential competitors? Okay, now the Facebook case, I think, has made a pretty good argument so far that Facebook assumed that Instagram and WhatsApp were serious potential competitors. Okay, if you look over the list of acquired firms, I would say a minority, perhaps a significant minority of those acquired firms fall into that category. Most of them are firms that offer this or that little innovation or complementary feature. Could they emerge? And I gave here the one example. This is a 2002 acquisition of, actually, I think it's 2022, of Google plus Breezometer. Now, Breezometer had developed a technology for displaying real-time information about air quality and pollen counts on a digital map. And Google acquired it in order to be able to add air quality searches to its basic map search services. So that is an acquisition of a complement, and sounds like it could be a fairly valuable one. The real question is, if that's the entire story, that merger should be left alone, right? We don't want to prevent Google from making a better search engine or a better map search engine. On the other hand, if there's a serious possibility that Breezometer is going to turn into a rival search engine or even a rival map search engine, that's something we have to take fairly seriously. But we probably need more than the mere fact that that's a logical possibility. We would have to have some kind of evidence that that is likely to occur. And that became the breaking piece of evidence in the Facebook case, not the mere possibility that WhatsApp could turn into a rival platform, but that there was actual evidence, or in that particular case, that Zuckerberg feared that WhatsApp or Instagram would turn into rival search engines. Because you always have to remember that with a merger of complements, you're usually treating a certain present gain against a probabilistic likelihood of competitive harm that would occur if this entity should become an active competitor. And as a result, I'm not as concerned about the problem of startup acquisitions in general as some people are. I do think that some of them are problematic, but by no means all. And in the piece of this slide that kind of fell off the bottom, I suggest that one possible alternative worth considering where there is a substantial possibility of harm is non-exclusive licensing. That is to say, if Google really let's say Facebook really needs WhatsApp's technological features that made messaging work better on handheld devices, that's one of the things Facebook wanted, then maybe we should limit Facebook to a non-exclusive license of that technology, leaving the rest of WhatsApp as a freestanding company and make it otherwise available to rivals. I'm going to slush through this one. I don't think there's anything good to be said about the guidelines renewal of trends toward vertical integration as a competitive concern. Today, I think the evidence is pretty clear. Firms integrate to save either production costs or distribution costs. Yes, if those cost savings really occur, then firms who are not vertically integrated will face pressure to integrate themselves, and then you'll see the trend. On the other hand, if vertical integration doesn't create any improvement at all, then it's less likely that that trend will emerge. Double marginalization has already been covered here, but basically the same thing. Double marginalization, first of all, applies to all mergers of complements, not merely vertical mergers. Economists all know that. Not all lawyers necessarily know that. But anytime you've got two complements together merging, each of them has market power in that particular complementary product, and the firms are unable to coordinate their output. You can have double marginalization problems, and a merger can remove those problems, although bargaining can do so as well. So I don't want to say any more about that one. On mergers and innovation, that's been very well discussed in the previous panel. One thing I think is that we're moving away from the inverted U. Not that it's wrong, it's just not particularly useful in merger analysis because innovation is so poorly behaved. So, using merger law to identify mergers that limit innovation is more similar to unilateral effects today than it is towards concentration increasing mergers. That is to say, we look at the innovation programs of the two merging firms mainly. If both of them have innovation activities within the same area, that merger is likely to generate some competitive threats. On the other hand, if the innovation history is complementary, one of them is doing innovation in a certain area and another one is not, then we're much more likely to, to realize benefits as a result of that merger. And finally, on networks and ecosystems, maybe I'll even get a little early out here so we can have lunch. I think the merger guidelines did extremely well to mention networks and ecosystems, and I applaud them for doing that. They did not appear in any earlier guidelines. On the other hand, I thought the picture they painted of these acquisitions was entirely too dark. Network mergers are mainly mergers of complements. That is, you've got two provided. You always have to ask one question, which is, are the two networks going to be integrated together as a consequence of the merger? One of the problems Zuckerberg is facing today is that, yes, he acquired Instagram, but Instagram was not integrated into Facebook. It's still pretty much a separately owned platform. But suppose Martha Stewart Living acquires Cooking Light, two cooking magazines in a field of about 50, okay? What's going to happen there? Well, subscription lists will be combined. Some people will drop, but nevertheless, they'll be combined. Advertising will be combined. The very likely impact will be a bigger platform. It faces considerable competitive constraints from other cooking magazines. And so I think that merger will very likely have beneficial effects. Same thing with respect to ecosystems. I think very much depends on the market share of the acquiring firm. So for example, if Microsoft is starting to integrate Teams, we've got some investigations going on into that. If there's a danger there, it resides in the fact that Microsoft Office has a very large market share. Otherwise, these things are complements, and complements frequently work better together than do unions of independently owned programs. And that means a couple of things, one of which is that we get involved in this endless problem of managing compatibility with third-party systems that can be very, very costly. So like I say, I applaud the addition of networks and ecosystems into the guidelines. I wish they had given a little bit more balanced view, principally the harms to be expected from mergers of networks and ecosystems, other than in cases of market dominance, is foreclosure harms. And foreclosure harms occur at much higher market shares than do collusion harms. So, we've got less reason overall to be concerned about them. I'm going to stop there, but I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you.